What if the life you've built, the lies you've told, and the choices you've made all come crashing down in one single moment? Join us as we dive into the chilling story of a man who thought he could outrun the consequences until his past caught up with him. Stay tuned, because what happens next will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about redemption and the price of betrayal. The room was quiet, too quiet. The air thickened, pressing down on the small, dimly lit space. A faint hum buzzed in the distance, like an insect trapped behind the walls. The smell of stale coffee lingered, mingling with something heavier. Something that made the hairs on the back of his neck rise. Detective Harris glanced at the files in front of him. Faces of criminals. Names that made his stomach twist. There was something unsettling about this case. He'd seen it all before, but this felt different. More personal. The door creaked open, cutting through his thoughts. A man stepped in. Harris didn't look up immediately, but he could feel the tension crackling in the air. "I know what you've done," Harris said, his voice low. The man didn't flinch, but the sweat glistening on his forehead said everything. Harris knew what it was like to live with guilt, to carry the weight of decisions made in the dark. He placed a file on the table. The man's name, blurred by time and memory, stared back at him. "Peter Clarkson," Harris whispered. The name hung in the air, dense and suffocating. Peter's eyes darted to the file, his face pale. For a moment it seemed like time stopped. Peter shifted, his breath quickening. Harris leaned back in his chair, eyes narrowing. "I'm not here to judge you," he said, but the words felt hollow. Peter shifted again, a bead of sweat tracing the edge of his jaw. "I didn't mean for it to happen," Peter muttered. His voice was hoarse. Harris said nothing. The silence stretched, pulling at the edges of the room like a tightening noose. "Tell me," Harris said, his tone sharp. Peter's eyes flickered to the door, as though searching for a way out. But there was no escape. "Tell me what you did," Harris repeated. Peter's breath hitched. His gaze dropped to the file, his face twisted in something close to regret. I didn't want anyone to get hurt," he stammered. "Too late for that," Harris said coldly. Peter's hands shook, his fingers tapping on the edge of the table. The tapping was quick, frantic, like the ticking of a time bomb. Something about the way he moved unsettled Harris further. Then, the door swung open. A woman stepped in, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. Harris didn't need to see her face to know who she was. Elizabeth Clarkson, Peter's wife. Her eyes were empty, hollow. The anger in them cut through the room like a blade. "You think he's the only one who deserves to suffer?" she asked, her voice icy. Peter recoiled as if slapped. Harris stayed still, watching the quiet storm unfold. Elizabeth stepped closer, her heels punctuating the silence. "I've seen what you've done," she hissed. Peter's eyes widened in fear. But Harris saw it. There was something about her that didn't fit the narrative. The way she spoke, the way she moved. There was something off. Something he hadn't seen before in this case. He stood, slow and deliberate, his gaze never leaving Elizabeth. "Maybe," he said, "it's not just him who deserves to pay." Elizabeth's eyes flashed with surprise, but the flicker was gone in an instant. Peter looked between them, his expression now one of pure dread. There was no escape from this. Not for him. Not for anyone. They were all tangled in a web of fate. And tonight, the consequences would unfold. The walls seemed to close in around him. Each breath felt heavier than the last. The room, the people, the air, they were suffocating him. Everything was closing in. And Peter Clarkson realized, with horrifying clarity, that his fate had already been sealed. The door slammed shut, echoing through the room with a resounding finality. The air grew thick with tension. Peter couldn't breathe. Elizabeth stood motionless, her gaze locked on him. Harris remained silent, the weight of his stare heavy. Peter's mind raced. He thought of the things he'd done, the lies, the betrayals. He could almost hear the echoes of his past choices, mocking him. Elizabeth took a step forward, the click of her heels growing louder. Each sound felt like a countdown, ticking towards something inevitable. "I didn't do it for this," Peter whispered, his voice breaking. His chest tightened, and he gripped the edge of the table. The room seemed to spin, reality blurring as guilt consumed him. Harris took a step toward the window, looking out into the darkness. His silhouette framed by the dim streetlight outside. The night seemed to stretch endlessly before them. A car drove by, the sound of its tires echoing faintly, a reminder that life continued outside. But here, in this room, there was no escape. Elizabeth's eyes never left Peter. Her stare was piercing, almost predatory. "You think you're the only one who suffered?" she asked. Peter's hands trembled. His past flashed before his eyes. Faces, names, the things he had done in the shadows. The things that now defined him. "I never wanted this," he said again, but this time, his voice was quieter. His words felt hollow in the stillness of the room. He could see the faintest trace of a smile tugging at the corner of Elizabeth's lips. A smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You had a choice," she said, her voice soft but deadly. Peter recoiled as if struck. The truth hit him harder than anything else. A sudden realization washed over him, cold and unrelenting. His choices had led him here. His choices had led to this moment. Harris finally turned away from the window, his face unreadable. He walked toward them slowly, each step deliberate. "No one gets away, Peter," he said, his voice like steel. Peter's heart pounded in his chest. This wasn't just about punishment. It was about justice. It was about what he deserved. The door behind them opened once more, cutting through the silence like a knife. A third figure entered. This one, much taller than the others. A broad-shouldered man with a face Peter vaguely recognized. John. Peter's voice cracked. John, his old partner, the one who had once shared in the spoils of their crimes. The man who had disappeared years ago. And now here he was, standing in front of him. "You should have known better," John said, his tone cold. He didn't even look at Elizabeth. His eyes were fixed entirely on Peter. Peter's mind was reeling, spinning with confusion and fear. John had been part of the plan. But now? Now it was clear. John wasn't here to help him. Not anymore. He was here for something else. Something final. "I didn't," Peter started, but his words caught in his throat. John stepped forward, cutting him off. "No more lies," John said simply. The air grew even colder. It was as though the very room was holding its breath, waiting for something to snap. Peter could feel his pulse in his throat. The moment of reckoning had arrived. And it was far worse than anything he had imagined. Peter's legs wobbled beneath him, his body betraying him. He couldn't escape. The room seemed to close in tighter, suffocating him with its weight. His eyes darted from one person to another. Elizabeth, cold and unyielding, Harris, calculating, and now John, towering over him like a shadow of his past. They were all there, and they knew everything. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," Peter gasped, his voice desperate. But his words sounded weaker with every breath. John's lips curled into a thin, almost imperceptible smile. "Not the first time you've said that, Peter," he said, his voice a low rumble. The truth stung more than Peter cared to admit. He had said it before. Too many times. But no one had ever believed him. Elizabeth took another step toward him, her heels clicking sharply against the cold floor. She stopped just in front of him, her gaze locked on his trembling form. "You really thought you could get away with it?" she asked, her voice unnervingly calm. Peter's chest tightened. He couldn't breathe. "Elizabeth," he started, but his throat was dry, his words barely audible. The air seemed to thicken around him, pressing against his chest with a force he couldn't escape. Elizabeth leaned in, her breath cold against his ear. "You're nothing but a pawn, Peter. A tool." Her words cut through him like a blade. He recoiled, but there was nowhere to retreat. "No," he whispered, shaking his head, trying to deny it. But the truth was undeniable. He had been a tool in their game, a puppet, dancing on their strings. "Why now?" Peter asked, his voice cracking under the weight of his realization. Why had they come for him now? Why hadn't they done this before? John stepped forward again, his presence overwhelming. "Because you're the last one standing," he said. "And it's time for you to face the consequences." Peter's eyes darted around the room, panic rising in his chest. The walls seemed to close in even more, the air thick with tension and dread. He could feel his heart pounding louder and louder, almost deafening. "I didn't mean it. I swear," he said, but it sounded empty even to his own ears. Harris, who had remained silent up until now, spoke again, his voice colder than before. "Everyone you've wronged, they're waiting for you, Peter." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Everyone he had betrayed, everyone he had hurt, they were all waiting for him, in the darkness. The walls seemed to close in faster now, the pressure building. And in that moment, Peter understood. There was no escape. No one was coming to save him. The choices he had made had finally caught up to him. And there would be no more running. No more lies. No more second chances. The final reckoning was here. And Peter Clarkson had nowhere left to hide. The room felt like it was spinning, the walls pulsating with every beat of Peter's heart. His hands were clammy, his legs shaking beneath him. He was trapped. The suffocating weight of his past decisions pressed down on him with crushing force. Every breath felt labored, as if the very air itself had turned against him. Elizabeth's eyes were unwavering, her gaze unblinking. John stood behind her, a silent sentinel, his expression hard as stone. And Harris was watching Peter with a strange, almost detached curiosity. "You think you can talk your way out of this?" John's voice rumbled again, cold and deep. Peter opened his mouth, but no words came. He couldn't speak. There was nothing left to say. The truth was staring him in the face, suffocating him with its weight. I didn't know," Peter managed to stammer, but his voice trembled. Elizabeth stepped closer, her heel echoing louder with every step. "I know," she said, her voice soft but laced with venom. "You didn't know. But you did it anyway." Peter's eyes widened, his chest tightening. "I didn't want to hurt anyone," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Elizabeth's laugh was cold. "So naive," she mocked, her words cutting through the air like a blade. Peter swallowed hard, his throat dry. I thought you were on my side," he said, his voice cracking with disbelief. Elizabeth's face twisted into a cruel smile. "We never were," she said simply. The finality in her tone sent a chill through his body. Everything he had believed was a lie. Everything he had trusted was a facade. Peter looked to Harris for some sign of compassion, some hint of mercy. But Harris only shook his head, his expression unreadable. "It's too late for mercy, Peter," he said, his voice flat, emotionless. Peter's world seemed to shrink. The air was growing heavier, the walls pressing in tighter. His vision blurred, the room spinning around him. He felt dizzy, like he might collapse at any moment. "You're not the victim here," John continued, his voice like gravel. "No," Peter whispered, his head hanging. He knew it now. He wasn't the victim. He was the one who had wronged them all. The one who had betrayed them. The one who had ruined lives. And now, the consequences were crashing down on him. Peter closed his eyes for a moment, trying to steady his racing heart. But when he opened them again, the faces in front of him seemed sharper, clearer. Elizabeth's eyes bore into him with icy intensity. John's gaze was unyielding. Harris stood in the background, his presence looming like a dark shadow. There was no way out. There was nowhere to run. And Peter knew He understood, with sickening clarity, that this was the end. The price for his sins had come due, and there was no escaping the reckoning. It was too late. Too late for redemption. Too late for apologies. Too late for anything. The silence in the room deepened, thick and suffocating. And Peter, once the one pulling the strings, now realized he was nothing more than a puppet in their hands. A puppet whose strings had finally been cut. The silence stretched on, suffocating. Peter's breath came in shallow gasps, his chest tight. His mind raced, but there was no way out. No words left to plead with. The past had caught up with him in ways he couldn't undo. And now it was time to pay. Elizabeth took one last step forward, stopping right in front of him. Her eyes locked on his, cold and unforgiving. "You thought you could hide forever," she said, her voice a whisper that sent a shiver down his spine. "I didn't know it would come to this," Peter whispered, his voice barely audible. Elizabeth's smile was empty. "Of course you didn't," she murmured. "And that's why you're here, Peter. Because you never saw it coming." Peter could feel his pulse thudding in his ears, a deafening reminder of how close he was to the edge. How close he was to losing everything. His hands clenched, his nails digging into his palms. He wanted to scream, wanted to fight, but his body refused to move. All that was left was the reality of the situation. And it was too late for any escape. Harris took a step forward, his eyes narrowing as he studied Peter. The detective had seen it all. The lies, the pain, the victims who never got justice. And now, standing before Peter, Harris was the judge. The one who would decide his fate. Peter's throat tightened as he tried to speak, to explain. But no words came. It was as though his voice had been stolen, swallowed by the oppressive weight of the moment. John's figure loomed behind Elizabeth, still silent, but the tension in his body spoke volumes. The game was over. There was no way out for Peter. And the consequences, once distant and abstract, now stood in front of him, tangible and inescapable. Everything he had built, everything he had taken, was about to crumble. "Please," Peter whispered again, but this time his voice was a broken plea. Elizabeth's expression softened, just for a moment, but there was no mercy in her eyes. There never would be. The door behind them creaked open again, the sound cutting through the stillness. A figure stepped into the room. Someone new. Peter's heart skipped a beat. Who else could it be? Who else had they brought to witness this final reckoning? The new arrival didn't say a word. Just stood there, watching. Peter's stomach twisted. He couldn't even look at the newcomer. All he could see were the faces of the people he had wronged, the people he had betrayed, the people he had abandoned. The shadows of his past reached out, encircling him, tightening like a vice. There was nowhere to hide, nowhere to run. And with each passing second, Peter felt more and more like the walls were closing in on him. He was no longer in control. He was a man caught in his own web of lies, the threads pulling tighter with every movement. The air was thick with tension, every heartbeat echoing in the room. And then, in the silence, came the voice of Harris. "Your fate was sealed the moment you chose this path," he said, his tone calm, but it carried the weight of finality. Peter closed his eyes. It was over. There was no redemption. No turning back. He had only himself to blame. The room, once a place of confrontation, now felt like a tomb. A tomb for Peter Clarkson. And there would be no escape. The silence grew heavier, more oppressive. Peter's chest tightened with every passing second, the air feeling denser, thicker, like it was pressing against him from all sides. His mind raced, but the weight of his actions, his choices, was too much to escape. It was clear now. There was no more time for bargaining, no more time for pleading. His past had finally caught up to him. Elizabeth's gaze never wavered. It was as though she had been waiting for this moment her entire life. And now it was here. Peter could feel the room closing in, the darkness swallowing him whole. Each breath was harder to take, each second stretching into eternity. The faint hum of the lights above him was the only sound that filled the suffocating silence. And then, the newcomer stepped forward, breaking the stillness. Peter's eyes shot up, meeting the cold, determined gaze of the person standing in front of him. It was a woman, a face he didn't recognize. Her expression was unreadable, but her presence was undeniable. "Who are you?" Peter asked, his voice cracking. She didn't answer. She only looked at him, her eyes piercing, almost as though she were seeing right through him. Harris shifted slightly, his posture tense as he observed the woman. Peter could feel the tension in the room rise even more, his heart pounding faster, harder. Was this another victim? Another person he had wronged? The woman took a step closer. The room seemed to shrink further, the weight of every moment settling on his shoulders. "You don't remember me, do you?" she finally asked, her voice steady, but filled with a quiet fury. Peter blinked, trying to place her face, but nothing came to mind. "I've never seen you before," he said, his voice shaky. The woman smiled, a cold, empty smile that sent a chill down his spine. "You don't remember, but I remember you." Her words hung in the air, sending a ripple of unease through the room. Peter's throat tightened as he searched her face, his mind scrambling. Who is she? What did she mean? "I'm the one you destroyed," she continued, her voice low, but firm. "You think you've gotten away with it all, but you haven't. Not by a long shot." Peter's eyes widened in realization. The weight of her words slammed into him, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, he felt a pang of fear deep inside. He wasn't just facing Harris, Elizabeth, and John. He was facing someone else, someone whose life he had shattered. Someone whose pain he had caused and forgotten. The woman's gaze never left him, her eyes cold as ice. "I came here for one reason, Peter," she said, her voice steady and deliberate. "To make sure you understood the price of what you did." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. And then, as if the weight of everything finally crushed down on him, Peter knew. He knew there was no way to undo the past. No way to fix what had been broken. He had been given the chance to make things right, but he had failed. Now, there would be no redemption. No escape. And as the room continued to close in around him, Peter finally understood the truth. He was alone. Alone with the consequences of his actions. And there was no turning back. The air felt like ice in his lungs. Peter could barely move, as if the weight of everything pressing down on him had turned his body into stone. He could hear his own heart, loud and deafening in his chest, but the room seemed to muffle everything else. The woman's words echoed in his mind, relentless, like a drumbeat that wouldn't stop. "To make sure you understood the price of what you did." Her voice had been calm, almost clinical, but it had cut through him like nothing else. And then, the realization hit him harder than anything before. It wasn't just the police. It wasn't just the people he had wronged standing in front of him. It was the ghosts of everything he had destroyed. His conscience, his past, all of it had come alive to haunt him in this moment. He wanted to run, to scream, but his body refused to obey. The room had never felt so small. Elizabeth's expression remained unchanged, stoic, unforgiving. John stood tall, like a dark sentinel, his arms crossed, watching with a cold detachment. Harris, the man who had hunted him down for so long, stood silently in the corner, his gaze never straying from Peter. And then the woman took one more step closer, her presence impossible to ignore. "You're going to pay for everything," she said softly, almost gently. Peter swallowed hard, trying to find his voice. But when he spoke, it was barely a whisper. "I didn't want this. I never wanted this." Her eyes narrowed, her expression unreadable. "You should have thought of that sooner." Peter felt a lump in his throat, the crushing weight of guilt settling deeper inside him. The walls were closing in. The space between him and the people surrounding him was now non-existent. The reality of the situation became undeniable. He wasn't going to walk out of this. There would be no more chances. No more second guesses. His choices had brought him here, and now the consequences were here to collect. The silence stretched again. It was suffocating, oppressive, like it was choking the life out of him. His body was shaking, but his mind was still spiraling, fighting for a way out that didn't exist. There was no escape from this moment, no way to rewrite the past. The woman stepped back, her eyes still locked on his, filled with a quiet fury. "Do you see it now?" she asked. Peter's gaze dropped to the floor, his mind finally quiet. Yes, he saw it. All the destruction, all the pain, the lives he had ruined, the people he had betrayed. And he had thought he could outrun it. He thought he could get away. But there was no escape. No more lies. No more pretending. The price was finally due. And Peter Clarkson was about to pay. The stillness in the room hung like a weight, heavy and suffocating. Peter's chest felt tight, his breath shallow. Each inhale seemed like it could be his last. The faces around him were cold, unmoving, each one bearing the scars of his past. The woman's presence felt like the final chapter of a book he had written long ago, only now realizing how poorly it had ended. He closed his eyes, but the faces remained, etched behind his eyelids. Victims he had long forgotten, their lives tangled with his. His mind replayed every wrong he had committed, every lie he had told, every soul he had betrayed. And now all of it had come to this. He had always thought he could outrun the consequences. But the truth had found him, and there was no escaping it. Elizabeth's voice broke the silence, soft but razor-sharp. "It's time to face what you've done, Peter. You wanted to play the game, but now it's over. You lost." Her words stung more than he could admit. The game he thought he could control had slipped through his fingers. He was no longer the one pulling the strings. John stepped forward, his eyes cold, and Peter felt the weight of their past, a past Peter had never fully understood until now. "I gave you every chance," John said, his voice low, like gravel. "You had every opportunity to make it right. But you chose this path. And now, it's time for the reckoning." Peter's knees buckled, and he felt himself sink to the ground. There was no fight left in him. He had given everything, and now he had nothing. Nothing except the price of his actions, and it was time to pay. Harris took a step forward, his face expressionless, as if all emotion had drained from him. "You thought you were smarter than everyone else," Harris said, his voice calm. "But in the end, you were just a man with a choice. And you made the wrong one." Peter couldn't respond. His lips felt dry, his mind numb. He had no words left. No excuses. Nothing but the crushing weight of his mistakes and the knowledge that the end was finally here. The reckoning had come, and it was too late to turn back. The final curtain had fallen, and Peter Clarkson, the man who had once believed he was invincible, now understood what it truly meant to face the consequences. The weight of the room settled on Peter like a suffocating blanket. There was no escape, no way out. His past, once distant and abstract, now felt as if it had become his own shadow, inescapable and relentless. His heart beat erratically, each thump a reminder of the ticking clock, of the time he had wasted, the chances he had squandered. He could feel his pulse in his ears, louder than any voice around him. His eyes flickered from one face to the next. Elizabeth, John, Harris, the mysterious woman, each one carrying a piece of the puzzle he had never fully understood until now. They were the ones who had been watching, waiting for him to unravel. And now here he was unraveled. "I never meant for it to go this far," he whispered, the words trembling on his lips, but they felt hollow, a confession that could never undo the damage. Elizabeth's gaze was unflinching, but it wasn't cold anymore. There was something else there, something deeper, a flicker of something human. We all make choices, Peter, she said quietly, her voice softer now, but no less final. But not all of us get to choose the consequences. Peter's eyes dropped to the floor, his body heavy with the weight of her words. He couldn't change the past. He couldn't undo the hurt, the betrayal, the lies. All he had left was the aftermath. John stepped forward, his shadow looming over Peter. I once thought you could be saved, he said. But some things, some choices, are beyond redemption. Peter didn't argue. He knew it was true. He had taken his chances, squandered his opportunities. Now, there was only the reckoning. The silence was thick, but it wasn't suffocating anymore. Peter sat there, broken but oddly calm, his mind quiet for the first time in years. He wasn't looking for forgiveness. He didn't deserve it. But as he sat in that room, surrounded by the people he had hurt, a strange peace settled over him. Not a peace of redemption, but a peace of acceptance. For the first time, Peter Clarkson understood the weight of his choices, and he was finally ready to face the consequences. The game was over, and there was no running from the truth.